Hi, thank you for joining this talk. My name is Telli Davoodi. I'll talk about the functional roles of scientific and religious explanations for existential questions. Religious and scientific cognition reflect the ways in which we answer important questions about life and death. In answering these questions, religion and science make different claims. But it's possible that religious and scientific cognition each play important functional roles in our psychology. We investigated this possibility by focusing on religious and scientific explanations for existential questions. Think of questions like how our universe came to exist, why there's suffering in the world, or what happens after we die. Explanations for these existential questions are ideal test cases for asking about the psychological roles of religious and scientific cognition. Because religion and science share the territory for explaining the existential, although they make different claims about our existence. And perhaps they share this explanatory space for the existential because candidate explanations are not only concerned with the truth and factual matters, but also reflect moral and social values like the meaning of life. For the purpose of this presentation, we'll call concerns with the truth and factual matters epistemic concerns, and for lack of a better term, we'll call concerns with the emotional, moral, and social values non-epistemic concerns. This brings us to the main question we're interested in. Namely, do scientific and religious explanations for the existential satisfy epistemic and non-epistemic concerns differently? If yes, this provides insight into the functional roles of religious and scientific cognition. Specifically, although both domains offer explanations for the existential, scientific and religious explanations may play different psychological roles, with the scientific responding more often to epistemic and the religious to non-epistemic concerns. Various patterns found in past works suggest a close link between scientific cognition and epistemic attributes like appeal to evidence. A different body of literature suggests associations between religious cognition and non-epistemic attributes, like moral and social concerns or issues related to identity. However, in asking this question, an important individual level variable to take into account is religiosity. Specifically, past work suggests that religious individuals may have a broader conception of epistemic qualities like evidence and causality. This means that for religious individuals, religious explanations may satisfy epistemic in addition to non-epistemic needs. Building on this past work, to answer our research question, we conducted two studies. In Study 1, we asked whether participants associate scientific explanations more strongly with epistemic qualities and religious explanations more strongly with non-epistemic qualities. And we also asked how religiosity might moderate these associations. In Study 2, we tested the psychological roles of explanations more specifically. We asked whether reflecting on epistemic needs positively predicts ratings of the quality of scientific explanations, and reflecting on non-epistemic needs positively predicts the quality ratings of religious explanations. And again, we asked about the role of religiosity. Let's focus on Study 1. In Study 1, to answer these two questions, we first went through a pre-registered procedure to generate explanations from Amazon Mechanical Turk workers to the three questions of how the universe came to exist, why there is suffering in the world, and what happens after we die. Without going much into the details of this procedure, we first generated 382 explanations to the three questions, and based on ratings of another group of participants, for each of the three questions, we selected 10 explanations that were classified by a strong majority as scientific and 10 classified by a strong majority as religious. Then for the main study, participants saw one explanation for one of the three questions and had to rate it using a 5-point scale going from strongly disagree to strongly agree on 25 qualities presented in random order, which measured epistemic values related to evidence, logic, and causal mechanism, among others, and non-epistemic dimensions related to social values, emotional implications, issues related to self-conceptualization, and morality. We then asked participants demographic questions, including a question about how religious they are, ranging from not religious at all to very religious. To look at the patterns, we first performed the factor analysis to confirm that the items capture epistemic and non-epistemic qualities in ways we had planned. And these are the factors we ended up with two epistemic factors, one related to ideas about objective truth and evidence, and the other related to ideas about subjectivity and unverifiability of the content of explanations. We also had non-epistemic factors, including a factor related to social implications, one related to negative emotional implications, like a particular explanation provoking anxiety, implications related to self-conceptualization, as well as two factors related to positive and negative moral value of explanations. Then, to answer the first question, we averaged agreement scores for items falling within each of these factors, which is what you'll see on the y-axis here. And we looked at the average responses within each factor for religious and scientific explanations. Let's take a look at the epistemic factors first. As you can see here, on attributes that measure how objective and evidence-based an explanation is, scientific explanations are rated higher than religious ones. On attributes that are the opposite of that, so namely objectivity and unverifiability, religious explanations are rated higher than scientific ones. What about the non-epistemic dimensions? With most of these dimensions, we also saw differences in the way the two explanation types were rated. For example, take a look at the social and the positive moral factors. Here, for both of these factors, religious explanations were rated higher than scientific ones. Now take a look at the negative emotional implications. Like this measured attributes like how much an explanation is anxiety provoking. And here, religious explanations were rated lower than scientific ones. On the other two factors here, the two explanation types were not rated significantly differently. But what about the role of religiosity? In fact, religiosity moderated these effects in interesting ways and in different ways for the epistemic and non-epistemic qualities. You'll see on these two graphs the average ratings for the objective and subjective epistemic considerations on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, religiosity. Here are the patterns for objective epistemic values, with a convergence in ratings of religious and scientific explanations as levels of religiosity increase. So with increasing levels of religiosity, participants were more likely to believe that both religious and scientific explanations are objective and fact-based. And here are the patterns for the subjective epistemic considerations, again showing convergence with higher levels of religiosity, such that with increasing levels of religiosity, here participants were less likely to believe that religious explanations are subjective and unverifiable. What about the non-epistemic factors? How were they moderated with religiosity? I'm going to show you one of the factors, the positive moral implications. And as you can see here, we see an opposite pattern from what we saw with the epistemic factors, such that with increasing levels of religiosity, there is divergence between religious and scientific explanations. With increasing levels of religiosity, then, participants were more likely to believe that religious explanations have positive moral implications here. And in fact, this pattern of divergence between ratings of religious and scientific explanations with increasing levels of religiosity held for most of the other non-epistemic factors, as you can see here. So to go back to our two questions from study 1, are epistemic qualities associated with scientific and non-epistemic qualities with religious explanations? Well, it's a bit complicated because it depends who we are talking about, since religiosity moderates these associations. We saw specifically that for religious U.S. adults, both religious and scientific explanations seem to be associated with epistemic value, but religious explanations had more non-epistemic value. For non-religious U.S. adults, only scientific explanations seem to have epistemic value, and neither scientific nor religious explanations had much non-epistemic value. So these are interesting associations, but in study 2, we looked at the psychological roles of scientific and religious explanations more specifically. We propose that religious explanations may more appropriately respond to non-epistemic psychological needs in response to existential questions, like the need for emotional comfort in the face of anxiety associated with death. Scientific explanations, on the other hand, may more appropriately respond to epistemic psychological needs in response to existential questions, like curiosity about factual evidence for what actually happens after death. We tested this possibility in Study 2 by asking how reflecting on epistemic and non-epistemic needs influences ratings of the quality of scientific and religious explanations, and we also asked about the role of religiosity. Specifically, we randomly assigned participants to one of two experimental conditions, where we primed epistemic or non-epistemic needs. In both conditions, participants were invited to reflect on and write a brief paragraph about a time when they tried but failed to solve a personal problem. Then in the epistemic need condition, we added epistemic qualities to this attempt to solve a personal problem, like wanting to take an objective stance. And in the non-epistemic need condition, we added non-epistemic qualities, like striving for emotional comfort. After participants reflected on this and wrote a brief paragraph, they were then invited to do a task, which was introduced as a different project, where we presented either 4 religious or 4 scientific explanations from Study 1 for the question about how the universe came to exist. And we asked them to rate how good they think these explanations are on a scale of 1 through 7. Similar to Study 1, participants answered a question about how religious they are. To answer our first question, we looked at the effect of each condition on the quality ratings of religious versus scientific explanations. So on the y-axis, you see the quality ratings. There was a significant interaction between experimental condition and explanation type. As you can see, in the epistemic condition, the scientific explanations are rated higher than the religious ones. And in the non-epistemic condition, although the trend looked similar, the difference was not significant. But again, what about the role of religiosity? Is it moderating these effects? And in fact, it was. To take a look at these patterns, we looked at the effect of the primes of the conditions for each question type across different levels of religiosity. And here are the patterns for the epistemic condition, and here are the patterns for the non-epistemic condition. As you can see, in fact, religiosity moderates the way in which the different conditions affected the quality ratings of the scientific and religious explanations. So consistent with results from Study 1, when you remind people of their epistemic needs, with increasing levels of religiosity, participants rate religious explanations to be as good as scientific ones. And again, consistent with findings from Study 1, when you remind people of their non-epistemic needs, with increasing levels of religiosity, participants rate religious explanations to be better than scientific ones. The ratings of the scientific explanations did not vary with increasing levels of religiosity in either condition. So to go back to our questions from Study 2 about the psychological roles of religious and scientific explanations, again, the answer to the first question is that it's complicated because it depends who we're talking about, since religiosity moderates the role that the explanations play for different people. Specifically, for religious US adults, we saw that the reminder of epistemic needs renders religious explanations for the existential equally good as scientific ones, but the reminder of non-epistemic needs renders religious explanations much better than scientific ones. For non-religious US adults, we saw that scientific explanations seem to be better than religious ones, regardless of what needs are primed. So to go back to our aim in this project, through 2 studies, one correlational and one experimental, we provided evidence that scientific and religious explanations do satisfy different psychological needs for people with different levels of religiosity. While for religious individuals, we show that religious explanations for the existential satisfy both epistemic and non-epistemic needs, for non-religious individuals, religious explanations do not play a particular psychological role, even non-epistemic roles. This suggests that the role of scientific cognition seems to be to mainly satisfy epistemic needs, like the need for verifiable, objective, and factual information, and it seems to be doing this for people with different religious backgrounds. Religious cognition, however, although its main function may be to respond to non-epistemic needs, like the need to belong to a social group, It only does this for individuals who believe themselves to be religious, and it does this in addition to serving epistemic roles for these people. This leaves open questions about the causal relationship between religiosity and the role of religious explanations in meeting non-epistemic needs, as well as questions about whether there are any circumstances under which non-religious people would reflect, or even in complete disbelief, wish for some kind of supernatural explanation for existential questions. More broadly, does supernatural cognition serve any role for non-religious individuals? These are questions we're currently following up on. With that, I thank all of you for listening, and I thank Tanya Lombroso, the Concepts and Cognition Lab at Princeton University, and the John Templeton Foundation. Thank you.